The stars whispered of war, and Sergeant Darius Cole listened. He stood on the observation deck of the UNS Resolute, staring into the void. It was quiet, almost peaceful, but he knew better silence out there was never a good sign. A message had arrived earlier, a desperate plea from a species the humans barely knew, the Serati, a race of reptilian beings with golden eyes and long, coiling tails. Their queen, Vilerus, had sent a broad-spectrum distress signal, broadcast in dozens of languages. Her daughter, Princess Keela, had been taken, not by pirates or rival empires, but by the Scarth, a shadowy species known only through fear and fragmented warnings. They moved like whispers, conquered without speaking, and vanished before anyone truly saw them. The galactic concord was crumbling, alliances dissolving in fear, but one soldier still believed in doing what was right. Darius wasn't a diplomat or a commander. He was just a soldier with too many scars and a heart he kept locked behind layers of steel. Still, something in the Queen's voice cracked through his armor. It wasn't just the desperation, it was the silence that followed, as if even the stars mourned with her. Command tried to brush it off. "It's not our war," they said. "Human interests aren't threatened." But Darius didn't care. He remembered being a boy during the Earth evacuation, how his own sister was taken by raiders and never found. He remembered the helplessness. So when the mission brief hit the System Q classified, suicidal, and unapproved, he signed. Up, no one else did. "I'll go alone," he told them. But the Resolute's captain gave him a team, small and fast. They took a stealth corvette, black as the void, and launched before politics could shut them down. Their target was buried in the edge of known space, near the dead spiral where navigation failed and ancient wrecks floated like ghosts. Intel suggested a Scarth outpost hidden inside an asteroid cluster surrounded by gravitational anomalies. No one had ever come back from there, but Darius wasn't going to turn around. Every hour lost was another hour that girls spent in a cage or worse. As they neared the asteroid belt, strange signals began to interfere. Their AI chattered in. "Warning, interference rising. Probability of enemy contact, 87%. Darius just grunted. He checked his gear, loaded a shock rifle, and reviewed the map again. The outpost was likely deep underground, and the only way in was a narrow, rotating tunnel system. Perfect for an ambush. The deeper they went, the stranger things got. Lights flickered without cause. Khan stuttered. One soldier, Ramos, said he heard voices, whispers through his helmet. "They're watching," he muttered, but Darius pressed on. They breached the main entry shaft using thermal cutters, slipping inside before the alarms could trip. What they found chilled them more than the cold vacuum outside. The facility wasn't just a prison. It was a lab, dark, wet, and humming with eerie energy. Stasis pods lined the walls, each filled with different species, all young, all unconscious. The Scarth weren't just capturing heirs, they were experimenting on them, learning their fears, turning them into weapons. Darius's fists clenched as he passed a shattered pod filled with frozen blood. "Find her," he ordered. They split into 2 units. Time was running short. Explosives were set along the exit. Routes, just in case. It was Cole himself who found her. Room 17C, a metal door covered in alien glyphs. Inside, a small figure sat on the floor, knees to chest, eyes wide and glowing faintly in the dark. Princess Keela. Her scales were pale. From fear, her small claws trembling. When she saw Darius, she didn't move at first. "Are you real?" she asked in a broken, fragile voice. He nodded, kneeling before her. "Yeah, kid, I'm real, and I'm getting you out of here." She stared at his face, then reached into her tunic and pulled out a torn cloth with the Serati royal crest. "My mom, she's waiting." "She sent me," Darius said, lifting her gently. She weighed nothing, but as he turned to leave, a low screech echoed through the halls. The Scarth were coming. "Move," he barked into his cum. They ran, Keela clutching his armor tightly, the enemy behind them. Black shapes slid along walls and ceilings, silent and fast. One soldier, Hayes, was dragged into the dark with a strangled cry. Another was wounded by a spear of shadow. But Darius didn't stop. His only mission was the girl. He reached the extraction point just as the charges blew, collapsing the inner tunnels. The ship was under fire already, shields flickering. Keela looked up at the chaos, her eyes wide. "Will we die?" she asked. Darius glanced at her, then smiled. "Not today." And with that, he sprinted up the ramp, cradling the princess as laser fire rained behind them. The ramp sealed. The ship jolted into hyperspace. And only then did Keela cry silent tears of relief as the man who wasn't her kind, didn't speak her language, and had nothing to gain, brought her back from the darkness. The stars around them flickered as the stealth Corvette shadow light slipped through hyperspace, the darkness outside calm but deceptive, like the deep breath before a storm. And Sergeant Darius Cole sat in the ship's rear cabin, armor scratched, arms tense, eyes locked on the small alien girl, curled up beside him. Princess Keela of the Serati, finally safe for now, but silent and shaking from what she had endured. And though Darius had seen war, seen people scream and burn and fall apart, he had never seen fear like this, not in someone so young. And not even the quiet hum of the ship or the soft glow of emergency lights could drown out the echo of what they had left behind. Because in that Scarth facility, they hadn't just found torture and imprisonment. They found something worse: knowledge. Plans, a list of species, names, weaknesses. And it was clear now that the Scarth didn't just want to conquer. They wanted to break the spirit of every empire by taking their children and twisting them into weapons. And Keela was not just a hostage. She was a key to something deeper, something dark still hidden in the stars, but Darius didn't share that with her. Not yet. He only placed a calming hand on her shoulder and said, "We're almost home." Though even he wasn't sure what home meant anymore. And back in the cockpit, the pilot, Lieutenant Mara Vance, frowned at the readings, her fingers dancing over the controls as strange signals pulsed across their sensors, faint, rhythmic bursts like breathing, not from any natural source. And she whispered into the cum, "Cole, we've got company. Something's following." "Use." And immediately he was up, rifle in hand, Keela clinging to his side as he stepped toward the front, where the black canvas of space was now split by a shape massive, angular and wrong, a Scarth dread cruiser emerging from hyperspace, like a beast slipping through curtains. And it didn't fire, not at first. It just hovered in silence, its many spines glowing faintly, and for a moment the shadow light was frozen. A single human ship facing a nightmare too big to outrun. And then the dread cruiser spoke not in words, but in thought, a pulse of psychic force that made Keela scream and fall to her knees, clutching her head as her eyes flickered gold and blue, and Darius knelt beside her, his voice calm but urgent. "Stay with me, Keela. You're stronger than they think," and even as alarms rang and shields dropped, she looked up at him with terror and whispered, "They see me, witch." Chilled Darius more than any enemy weapon could, because the Scarth didn't need to track them by tech. They were using her, the princess, as a beacon, and she hadn't even known it. So now it wasn't just a chase, it was a trap, and their ship's AI, Argo, calculated odds of escape as less than 12%. But Darius didn't slow down, didn't retreat, because fear was useless when you had a child to protect, and he shouted, "Prepare for the pulse drift," a dangerous maneuver that could shatter the ship if done wrong, but it was their only chance, and Mara nodded, rerouting power, aligning the engines with the nearest pulsar, a spinning star of death that could destroy them but also blind their enemy if used right. And just as the dread cruiser began to open its weapon bays, the shadow light darted into the storm of gravitational waves, every surface trembling, lights flashing red, Keela sobbing in confusion while Darius strapped her into a chair and braced himself as the engines screamed and the ship spun sideways through the surge. And for one terrifying moment, everything went white, like time itself had cracked. And then there was nothing, only silence, deep and perfect, the kind that made hearts race. And when the systems came back online, the dread cruiser was gone. Vanished from radar, no signal, no pursuit, only the faint echo of Keela's crying, and the low hum of a ship running on emergency power. And Mara looked at Darius with a pale face and whispered, "I think we lost them." But he wasn't sure, because the Scarth didn't give up. They waited, learned, evolved, and as the shadow light limped toward the edge of Serati space, Darius watched Keela sleep in fitful rest, wondering what they had done to her in that lab, what had been planted, what had been triggered, and he vowed quietly that he would get her home, even if he had to burn through a dozen dread cruisers to do it, because he wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was her guardian now, and nothing, not even the cold silence between stars, would stop him from keeping her safe. Flames sparked in the airlock hallway as the shadow light dropped out of hyperspace near the Serati border, its hull groaning under the stress of the last maneuver, smoke curling from broken panels, while warning lights flashed red across every screen. And Sergeant Darius Cole stood at the center of it all, blood on his shoulder, sweat on his brow. But his grip never loosened from the shock, rifle slung at his side, as he kept a constant eye on the young alien girl, just a few steps behind him. Princess Keela, still shaken but now alert, her golden eyes flicking toward every sound, every flicker of movement, and though she was silent, he could tell she understood what was happening. The way she clutched the piece of cloth bearing her mother's crest tighter against her chest showed she knew this wasn't over, not even close, because just as the ship's AI Argo announced proximity to friendly space, a new alarm screamed. From the bridge, a dread cruiser signal had reappeared, stronger, closer, and moving fast, and there was no question about who it was. The Scarth were back, more aggressive than before, and this time they weren't cloaked in silence. They came with power, blasting into real space like a beast unchained, weapons charged and ready to destroy everything in their path. And in the cockpit, Lieutenant Mara Vance cursed as she saw the trajectory, her fingers flying across the controls, trying to reroute the damaged engines and push the Corvette to move faster. But the power cells were low, and their jump core hadn't cooled from the last pulse drift, which meant they had no second escape, no clever trick, just one option fight. And even that wasn't promising against a ship 20 times their size. So Darius quickly gathered the team, those who were still standing after the last encounter. Just 5 soldiers now, including himself, tired, wounded, but still willing to follow him into the dark, and he looked each of them in the eye before saying one thing: "We hold until she's safe." And they all nodded, no speeches needed, because they weren't fighting for orders or medals. They were fighting for the girl, for the idea that someone had to stand between her and the monsters that wanted to use her. And as they scarfed, ship began firing bursts of energy that lit up the black void like purple lightning. The shadow light took evasive paths, dipping and twisting through asteroid fields near the border, hoping the terrain would give them cover. And for a moment, it worked. The larger enemy ship slowed, scanning for a clear shot, and that gave Darius just enough time to reach the launch bay, where the ship's last defense, an old but functional rail turret, waited like a sleeping dragon. And he climbed into the gunner's seat, linked the targeting system with his neural implant, and told Mara to keep the ship steady for at least 10 seconds, which she called impossible, but tried anyway, flying the Corvette like a leaf through a hurricane. And as the dread cruiser emerged from behind a shattered moon, Darius opened fire, launching a hail of metal slugs directly into its forward sensors, sparks flashing across its hull, and the beast flinched, its weapons missing their mark. But then the retaliation came: 3 focused beams that tore across space, one of them catching the rear thrusters of the shadow light, sending the ship spinning sideways, systems failing one by one. And Mara screamed over comms that they were going down, crash course into a barren moon just inside Serati territory. And Darius jumped from the turret, racing through smoke-filled halls to grab Keela before the impact, throwing both of them into a crash harness just as the ship slammed into the ground. Metal twisting, alarms blaring, everything turning upside down for a breathless moment before stillness took over, broken only by groans of injured crew and the soft crackle of small fires. And when Darius opened his eyes, Keela was still breathing beside him, clutching his arm, whispering something in her own language, and he nodded even though he didn't understand, unbuckled them both, and began pulling the team from the wreckage, finding Mara half-conscious, her leg pinned under a console, and dragging her free just as the sound of enemy boots began echoing from outside the hull-scarred ground troops, moving fast and silent across the moon's surface, drawn to the crash like predators to blood. And there was no time to think, only act. So Darius signaled the survivors, gathered weapons, and formed a line near the airlock, handing Keela a small shock beacon and telling her, "Only use this if I fall," which she didn't want to take, shaking her head. But he placed it in her claws anyway, and turned to face the breach, where shadows moved just beyond the smoke, fast and inhuman. And then the fight began, one last stand under the open stars, human rifles blazing in the dust, alien weapons firing, beams that turned metal to glass, and through it all Darius fought like a man with nothing left to lose. protecting a child he barely knew but had come to believe in more than anything. And when the last enemy fell and the silence returned, broken only by the sound of a Serati rescue ship descending through the sky, Darius dropped to his knees, exhausted but smiling, as Keela ran to him and threw her arms around his neck, whispering, "You stayed," and he whispered back, "Told you I would." Before everything finally went dark, the royal city of Valmara shimmered beneath twin suns as the Serati homeworld spun slowly in its eternal rhythm, the towering crystal spires glinting like spears of light, while banners of gold and blue swayed gently across bridges in the wind. And in the highest chamber of the Queen's citadel, Valeris stood silent, her tail curled tightly beneath her, golden eyes fixed on the horizon. As her hands trembled for the first time in years, because the message had come only hours ago, a human vessel downed just across the border, carrying her daughter, Princess Keela, and guarded by a lone Terran soldier who had fought Scarth, death ships, and survived. And though the Queen had tried to remain still and noble before her council, once she was alone, her composure cracked like old stone, and she turned to the great mirror in her chamber, not to see her reflection, but to whisper to it, "Hold on, my child," because no empire, no rank, no title could stop the pain of a mother waiting in silence. And then the doors burst open as her guards escorted in a battered group of humans, their armors scorched, their eyes weary, and among them stood Darius Cole, still standing tall though his uniform was torn, his side wrapped in bandages, and walking just ahead of him, small but proud, was Keela, her steps slow, her eyes scanning the chamber. And when her gaze met her mother's, everything else vanished, all sound, all tension, all protocol, and she cried out in a voice filled with relief and love, "Mom!" as she ran across the polished floor, arms outstretched, and the Serati Queen, ruler of 7 systems, warrior of 3 wars, speaker of 1,000 languages, dropped to her knees and opened her arms, her royal robes crumpling as Keela collided into her. Both of them embracing tightly, their tears silent but shining in the sun, and none of the guards moved, none dared speak, for they saw something sacred in that moment. And when the Queen finally lifted her face, her eyes met Darius's, and he saw something there that no words could match: gratitude, sorrow, fear, and strength all at once. And she stood slowly, still holding her daughter, and walked to him, her voice soft but steady as she said, "You brought her home." And he nodded, simply replying, "I promised." And though she wanted to say more, to honor him in front of her people, the moment was broken by the sound of a deep chime and alarm from the palace systems, and the mood shifted, hearts freezing, because the royal AI spoke next, announcing an emergency. Scarth signal detected in high orbit. One vessel, silent, no weapons active, awaiting orders, and all eyes turned to the Queen, who held her daughter tighter now, her voice colder as she asked, "What do they want?" And Darius, standing near the center of the room, frowned deeply and said, "It's not an attack. It's a message." And they all moved to the command balcony, where a large hologram flickered to life, showing the dark form of a Scarth. Envoy tall, faceless, voice like ice scraping metal as it spoke in flat tones, "We do not seek war. We seek return." And behind it, barely visible, was a chamber of stasis pods, filled with other royal children from across the galaxy. unconscious but alive, and Darius realized the terrible game that had been played. Keela had not been the only key, only the first to be tested, and now the Scarth were negotiating, showing the rest as bargaining chips, warning them not to resist or the others would be erased from existence. And Valeris turned away from the screen, her jaw clenched, her tail lashing behind her, and she whispered, "They want me to kneel." And Darius stepped forward, his voice sharp. "You can't. If you give them anything, they'll take everything." But she looked at him with haunted eyes and asked, "What would you do if it were your daughter?" And he didn't answer, because the truth was already on his face. So she returned to the throne, her mind racing, while Keela sat quietly beside her, watching everything, understanding more than anyone realized. And as night fell over Velmara, Darius walked alone through the gardens outside the palace, watching the stars, wondering how the Scarth had tracked them again, how they knew exactly when to appear. And that's when he heard soft footsteps behind him, and Keela appeared, holding something small and glowing in her hand, a fragment of tech embedded in her tunic, almost invisible, a tracking shard, likely planted during her captivity. And she said softly, "I think it's mine." And Darius knelt beside her, carefully taking it, studying its markings, and feeling the weight of 100 new dangers, because now it was clear the Scarth hadn't just wanted to test fear. They were watching, learning, adapting, and they weren't finished yet. Not by a long shot. The palace of Velmara was quiet under the early morning sky, but the peace was thin, like paper hiding a storm beneath it. And as the suns rose higher, their light falling across the smooth silver floors and shining towers, Sergeant Darius Cole stood near the royal hall's inner gate, eyes sharp, mind heavy. The small tracking device Keela had found now locked in a containment field just below the throne room. Yet even with it removed, something felt wrong, like a shadow still moved among them, unseen, and the Queen felt it too. Her guards tripled. At every door, her advisors whispering theories and fears as she tried to balance the politics of the moment with the heart of a mother still clinging to her daughter, who now wandered the palace with quiet steps, always followed by 2 guards, always looking back as if something watched her still. And Darius didn't trust it, any of it, because he knew from war that the enemy didn't always attack from above sometimes. They came through open doors wearing familiar faces, and he'd seen too many perfect plans fall apart from within. So when he received a quiet ping from the palace AI, asking him to come alone to the archives chamber, he moved fast but careful, weapon at his back, every step echoing down the long glass hallway until he reached the lower levels, where cold air wrapped around old data cores and stone columns. And there, flickering weakly, stood an AI projection, a golden-eyed copy of Argo from the Shadowlight. Its voice low and uncertain as it said, "Someone accessed the royal system last night without clearance." And Darius frowned, stepping closer as the image shifted to show movement logs. A signal traced not to a Scarth ship, but from inside the palace walls, through a private console that belonged to a senior advisor named Thalon Ray, a trusted voice of the Queen for over 2 decades. And as Darius stared at the data, his gut tightened, the pieces falling into place. How the Scarth always knew where Keela was, how their messages came exactly after key meetings, and why their threats grew more focused. And it wasn't tech alone doing it. Someone was feeding them information, and now he had a name, but the real danger wasn't proof, it was time, because while he raced back to the throne room to warn the Queen, Thalen Rhee was already there, standing beside her during a high council session, his voice calm, his hands folded as he advised surrender, calling the Scarth's latest offer merciful, and saying they ask only that we remain neutral, that we not interfere further. And while some in the council nodded, tired of fear, the Queen looked troubled, her gaze flicking toward Keela, who sat beside her, head bowed, and then toward the entrance where Darius suddenly appeared, walking straight through the guards, eyes locked on Thalen, voice raised for all to hear. He's been feeding them, and the room froze. Shocked silence, broken only by Thalen's soft reply. You dare? But Darius didn't blink, didn't flinch, just tossed the evidence crystal into the air where it spun, projecting the logs across the chamber. Every secret signal, every coded message traced to Thalen's private line, and the Queen rose slowly from her throne, her hands clenched, her voice shaking not with fear, but betrayal, as she said, "You were my friend." And Thalen's expression shifted, no longer calm, but hard, proud, unashamed, as he spoke the truth of his choices, saying, "The Scarth will rise no matter what we do, but I chose to ensure our place beside them, not beneath their heel." And that was when Darius saw it, the faint shimmer in Thalen's hand, a small device blinking red, and he moved faster than thought, lunging forward just as Thalen pressed the trigger, a pulse weapon built into his sleeve, activating with a sharp crack that would have taken the Queen's life, if not for Darius's shoulder taking the blow, the blast knocking him sideways, pain blooming across his chest, as guards swarmed a traitor, slamming him to the floor, his device shattering as Keela screamed, running toward Darius, who was already pushing himself up, blood leaking down his side, but eyes still on the Queen, making sure she was safe. And as the guards dragged Thalen away, hissing in shame, Valeris stood tall above the council, voice steel as she said, "Let this betrayal end today." And for the first time since Keela's return, the court stood united, no longer questioning, no longer hesitating. And while Darius was taken to the med bay, Keela sat at his side, her small hand holding his tightly, and whispered, "You always know who the enemy is." And he smiled faintly, even in pain, because he knew it was never that simple, that more enemies would come, some loud, some silent. But now they had a chance to fight back truly, and not just with weapons, but with truth. And as night came again to Velmara, the Scarth vessel above finally moved, not in peace, not in war, but in quiet retreat, vanishing into the dark as if it sensed its game had ended for now. The stars above Velmara burned bright like diamonds in an ocean of dark, and though the palace stood strong and the Scarth ship had disappeared into silence, the fear had not gone, not truly, for everyone knew that something deeper was coming. And while Queen Valeris walked among her people with her daughter safe at her side, her heart remained heavy, because peace born of fear was never real, and Darius Cole, now healing slowly in the royal medbay, could feel it too, that strange pressure in the air, like the universe was holding its breath, waiting, watching. And as he looked out from his window into the alien sky, he wondered if Earth even knew how close they'd come to war, or if anyone back home understood what it meant to stand between two civilizations, to guard a child not of his blood, but dearer to him than many he had once called brother. And then the call came, a transmission, encrypted, urgent, not from Serati's space, but from a hidden human listening post beyond the far edge of the sector. And the message was short. There, moving Scarth fleet, thousands, target unknown, possibly Velmara. And before the AI even finished decoding it, Darius was already up, ignoring the pain in his side, pulling on his gear and calling to the Queen, who met him halfway, eyes flashing with the same fury and fear. And within the hour, the High Council chamber became a war room, maps flashing in the air, patrols rerouted, defenses primed, but it was clear that the Serati were not ready, not for this, not for a full assault, not when their trust had only just begun to heal. And it was then that Darius made a choice, one he hadn't planned, one he hadn't dared speak of since the day he'd landed. He called Earth, not through standard channels, but through the deepest, oldest link he had, a backdoor line to Admiral Reeve, the only commander who had ever truly trusted him. And when the human leader's face appeared, grizzled and sharp-eyed even across the light years, Darius spoke simply. They're coming. Velmara can't stop them alone. And Reeve didn't ask for reports or proof. He only nodded, sighed, hold the line, and vanished. And less than 2 hours later, deep space flared with light, and humanity answered, not with talk, but with steel and fire, as 3 Terran strike fleets dropped from hyperspace around Velmara, a show of force so sudden and so bold that even the Serati guards gasped. But Darius smiled grimly. Standing at the edge of the royal platform beside Queen Valiris, as Earth ships flew into defensive positions, their hulls black and gold, bristling with weapons and shields, and he said quietly, "We never abandon our own." And she looked at him, pride and gratitude mixing with something more, hope, and perhaps something else unspoken. And though their alliance was new and fragile, in that moment it burned bright, like something ancient and powerful reborn. And then the sky changed again, this time darker, as the Scarth fleet arrived, not silently, not stealthy, but bold and brutal, ship after ship like blades of shadow slicing through the stars. And for a long moment no one moved, no one fired. And then a message came through, not to the Queen, not to Darius, but to Keela, directly to her, voice smooth, full of poison, the Scarth commander saying, "Child of the throne, surrender yourself and no blood will fall." And the girl stood frozen, caught between fear and fury, but then she stepped forward, surprising everyone, and replied with a voice clear and strong, "This is my home. I will not run." And in those simple words, something changed, not just in the Serati minds, but in the humans too, for even Reeve himself, now orbiting high above, sent a private message to Darius. "She speaks like a leader," and Darius only replied, "She is one." And then the war began. Not in fire at first, but in motion, ships shifting into formation, shields locking together, as Serati and Terran vessels formed a joint wall of light and energy. And when the Scarth at sea struck, they struck hard waves of fighters, pulse beams, gravity warps. Dark tech meant to tear space itself, but this time they didn't break through, because Earth's weapons were built not just to fight, but to endure. And the Serati, for all their elegance, had fire of their own, and together they held, not perfectly, not without loss, but strong enough to slow the enemy. And Darius led from the ground, boots in the soil, calling targets and rallying soldiers, his voice carrying over fire and smoke as the palace grounds turned into a shielded command center. And when the Scarth tried to land drop ships, he was the first to meet them, rifle blazing, backed by human and Serati warriors alike, fighting not for empire or glory, but for something more real, a future. And when one of the Scarth commanders finally breached the inner lines and tried to take Keela by force, he did not find a scared child, but a queen in waiting, standing beside her mother with a blade in one hand and a defiance in her eyes that made even a monster hesitate. And Darius was there too, always a step behind her, not as her protector anymore, but as her soldier. And when the final push came, when the Scarth fleet began to fall back, beaten not by power alone, but by unity, by something they could not break, Darius stood atop the palace wall, his armor cracked, his hands shaking, and watched the enemy retreat, a slow, bitter crawl into the dark. And when it was done, when the last threat vanished into stardust, the silence that followed was not empty, but full of breath of survival, of a new world born from pain. And as the people of Valmara emerged from their shelters, as ships landed bringing aid and relief, Darius finally allowed himself to sit down, not in weakness, but in peace. And Keela came to him, her robes torn, her face smudged, but her smile bright, and she knelt beside him, whispering, "You stayed." And he looked at her, then up at the stars, and answered, "Because sometimes humanity's light shines brightest when the night is darkest." And somewhere high above, the Earth fleet turned slowly homeward, leaving behind not just allies, but family forged in war and ready for whatever came next.